Welcome back. All right. So earlier this week, we started off by talking about Unit 4 and how we're going to wrap up the year by completing Unit 4. And I gave you these three assessment guidelines that we'll be working on. So I told you that we are going to be finding descriptive language as evidence to comprehend and interpret works of fiction. Not just you're going to need to show me that you understand what's going on in a work of fiction, but also you're going to need to interpret like the meanings of those works of fiction. You're going to need to analyze, so go deeper with that interpretation by using imagery and word choice or diction to be able to analyze a character and a setting that's present. So going beyond just like saying this is what happened, but also this is what I'm learning about the character and the setting through this descriptive language. And then finally, you're going to need to be able to write about that in an essay using a thesis, multiple paragraphs, including introductions, body paragraphs, and conclusions, and transitions. And I want to remind you that all of this is stuff that we've worked on in previous work, both in class and since school shut down. So there isn't so much new learning going on here as it is an opportunity for you um, to really refine some of those skills, show me that you're still growing and learning, and possibly raise grades from where they currently sit. So on earlier this week when you did the first lesson and I went over this stuff, we looked at an example from William Faulkner and his book, The Sound and the Fury. And we were really working on, if you were paying attention, these first two skills, right? So the reading skill, just being able to comprehend and interpret what was going on in this short example that I showed you, and also the analysis skill, the picking out imagery and word choice and figuring out what it was telling us about character and setting. And I gave you some examples of that, and then your job was to go and practice with a few other examples on Canvas and submit that. So what I'd like you to do now is, if you can, think back or look back at the work that you did on Canvas. What did you find in terms of imagery and word choice, and what did you think it told you about character and setting? I'm going to go over in more detail now some of the things that you may have found in that work, and I want you to self-assess. I want you to think to yourself, how well did you pick up on the things that I now am going to go over with you? Did you get it? I hesitate to say right or wrong, but there are some things that are hidden in this example that I'm curious to know, or you should be curious to know. Did you pick up on certain hints that William Faulkner was dropping that he really did intend for you to pick up on? So let's take a look at that. So let's remind ourselves just what we talked about on well, earlier this week, whichever day that was for you. So oh, excuse me, and sorry, and also I do recommend that you probably take some notes here. Again, this is all for your benefit so that you can show growth in the assessment later on in a few weeks. We read this excerpt from The Sound and the Fury, and we talked about how the image of looking through the fence kind of told us about the character, right? That this is a character who is, separate from everybody else, and almost maybe it makes us wonder, like, why are they separate? What is it about this character that makes that separates them? We also looked at the diction choice of the word hunting, and talked about how, why didn't they use the word searching or looking, but they used the word hunting, and that brings up connotations of maybe the underlying sinister nature of things, or possible violence, or things like that. So that's where we stopped, and then you went and you found your own examples and analyzed them. Now I want to break it down for you a little bit more specifically. So I want to start with the character. Now this is a lot of information, and I know that your inclination is just to stop, to tune me out, and to just read the information and move forward. But please, it's possible that I'll say something here that you didn't pick up on, so please listen as well. If we first start at looking at the character, what else are we learning about this character here? The first thing that I notice is that the character, and by the character I mean the person telling the story from this first person point of view, the person who's behind the fence looking through, uh, he's treated, or they, since we don't know for sure if it's a man or a woman, are treated almost like an inferior, even though they're 33 years old. So we learn that they're 33 down in that paragraph 3. Um, and but this fully grown adult is still being treated as an inferior, right? They're behind the fence. So we've got the imagery of them being behind the fence. It's also implying that they're disliked by other people. So, we could be wondering, what is it about them that causes them to be disliked? So again, the imagery of looking through the fence helps us see that, right? This image of them just being physically separate and having to peek through the fence up there in paragraph 1. Um, the, um, there's another image in paragraph 2 of people walking away, right? They went across the pasture, I held to the fence and watched them going away, right? Like he almost, or they, I guess, almost seem powerless and unable to follow along, right? Like they're being treated as, or even ignored as something that doesn't matter. Maybe these people do know that this character is there, apparently, because they speak to him later, but they don't seem to care for him at all. When the character of Luster speaks, then we've got specific word choices that imply condescension toward this person. So he says, "Ain't you something," right? Like there's this just kind of like nastiness to it. Listen to you now, right? So the way that those words have been chosen to just kind of sound kind of mean and condescending. Um, I done went all the way to town to buy you that cake, right? Like the way that those words are being chosen to say, I've done this for you, uh, and then hush up, telling him to be quiet. Ain't you going to help me find that quarter so I can go to the show tonight? Almost as though the main character who's being spoken to is being commanded to do something, almost like a servant, that they're condescended to. Um, Imagery of hush up that moaning, right? Like that maybe our character, the one telling the story, is actually, this would be an auditory cue, but is actually making some kind of noise, moaning noise. What does that sound like? And so we begin to perhaps wonder if they're being treated as inferior, maybe because they're cognitively disabled, like they're acting more like a child. They've never developed beyond childhood. Is that a possibility? There's something about this character that implies that they're not all there, right? So there's a lot to really be picked apart here just from the imagery and the diction and what it's really implying about the character. Um, and then we've got the setting. So what are we looking at about the setting? Now, here's the thing that, on that some of you, I would expect many of you to have picked up on, that the character is, not respected as much. I wouldn't necessarily have expected as many people to pick up on the fact that they're on a golf course, that this is a well-kept, beautiful place. I implied to you that there was something kind of sinister and mean about this place, um, which is true, but also that we can look here and we can say, oh, I see, they're on this golf course, and even though that this is a beautiful, well-kept golf course, that there is something kind of mean about it. There is that this place is not the nicest place in terms of the feeling of it, right? The tone toward the golf course is not great, even though it may be a beautiful place. So we've got word choices like hitting and hunting and flag. Hitting and hunting, those are both words associated with violence, right? Violence and death and blood, and but they're also associated with golf, right? So you use your clubs to hint. If you hit the ball into the longer grass or into the forest or into the sand trap, then you have to hunt for it, right? The flag is really the word that sets us off there because you've got a flag at the hole. But again, different words could have been used to get that across, and it's more important that we're figuring out that we're being introduced to this kind of negativity of the place and then realizing that it's a golf course. Then we can start picking up on the beauty of the place with diction like flower and pasture. Flower, I believe, is used at least twice in paragraph 1, and pasture is used once. Pastures are usually very calm and peaceful places, in contrast to the kind of violence implied in it. We've got all this springtime imagery in paragraph 1 especially as well. The curling flower spaces. Let's see, there was the flower tree, right? All these visual cues. Just the greenness of the grass that we're seeing, right? All of those are visual cues. And yet we come back to this imagery of the separation of through the fence and the negativity and the violence of the place. And so we're learning a lot about the place as well. We might also imply that people who play golf are a little bit more refined, tend to have a little bit more money, so we may also be learning a little bit more about the character as well. This is a lot of information that we can get just by looking at the imagery and the diction. We learn a lot about the characters and a lot about the settings. But why is this important? And again, I would recommend that you take some notes here. If you weren't taking notes on the previous slide, you might want to go back and kind of look at those things. Because what it really comes down to is, well, okay, I know more about this place through the imagery and the setting. I know more about this character through the imagery and the setting, but why is it important? And so what we might do is write a thesis for it now. Here's a possible thesis statement that we could write after having analyzed those 3 paragraphs that I just showed you. So I said, although William Faulkner's diction and imagery at first imply negativity and violence, still, a second read reveals a stereotypically peaceful setting as well. Therefore, the contrast of tension with serenity implies that the main character will struggle to understand the true nature of their situation in this novel. So I point out the 2 things that we noticed, right? I use diction and imagery to first imply the negative side of things, and then imply that if we read again and we read more carefully, that diction and imagery also reveals us the stereotypical kind of peacefulness to it. So what that tells us, this contrast is building tension, right? That there will be elements of peace and possibly violence and negativity, and that this character is going to really struggle in this novel to understand what is going on and how they fit into that whole thing. And we can say all of that just from what we found in these 3 paragraphs. We could write a whole paper about how just these 3 paragraphs can get us to that point, to that understanding of the character and the place. And so we could write this paper. The introduction would be the introduction paragraph would need to grab our attention, give us the background information, and then provide us with the thesis. And then we would show in body paragraph 1 how diction and imagery are giving us the negative side of things. Body paragraph 2 would give us the diction and imagery for serenity, right? We would provide evidence for that and analyze how the evidence shows us that. And then our concluding paragraph would really help us see the complexity of this contrast, right? So essentially what I've just done is walked you through the entire possibility of this paper. This whole lesson has walked you through the entire possibility of this paper. It's possible that you could have been given this and said, okay, now write a paper about how, what are we learning from these creative uses of language. I'm not going to make you do that with this. However, I am pointing out to you how it is possible. I'd also like to remind you to go back and see, like, how accurate did you get with the work that you did on Canvas? How close did you get to what I pointed out to you here? If you were really far off, then you know that there's some work that you need to do and maybe some questions that you need to ask me. Maybe you need extra help and maybe you need to email me. If you got really close, great. Then maybe some of the future practices that we do will be a little bit more tricky, a little bit more challenging for you. So have an excellent weekend, and I will see you for more practice and more lessons next